we are going live, which is awesome. We're live on Twitter or X and YouTube. I want to thank all three of you for being here. It means a lot. I'm really very excited for this conversation. Each of you are just experts in your own way, and it's really cool to be able to do this. So, as people are joining in, I'll kind of explain to you who I am, how these conversations tend to work, and then I would love for each of you to introduce yourselves, a little bit about your background, and we can get into the main topics. For everyone listening and joining, if you don't know me, my name is Troy Goldenberg. I am here because I created a podcast and space host platform around a lot of topics, but obviously the past few months, it's just been this one topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts, and something that we want to see is peace in the region and just, prosperity for everybody. So I've had the good fortune and good luck through good breaks and hard work of meeting all three of these people here now, and they are experts in their own way. So I'll let each of them introduce themselves. John, if you want to go first.
Hello there. I'm John Aziz. I'm a British Palestinian from the UK. I'm an advocate for peace, advocate for reconciliation and a reconciliation process. And obviously, I'm an advocate against the horrible terrorism and war that we're seeing on the ground right now.
Amazing. Eric?
Hi, my name is Eric Rubin. You may know me by my handle, Captain Allen, at Captain Allen History on Twitter, which is something I started just a couple of months actually before October the 7th. Certainly did not know that was coming, but had seen a lot of things changing in the world anyway and felt that I needed to step up and do something. I've been a practicing attorney for 15 years. I've also spent 20 plus years studying literally every day of my life. Israeli and Jewish history really started for me, half my life ago at 20 at the University of Cambridge, where I studied the British Mandate. And since then, I've kept notes on basically every book and documentary I've ever read or watched. And it's about 3,000 single-space pages now. And it's from that I often try to get my ideas and information for sharing tweets on Twitter. And I've also begun putting Jewish history into an animated profile, hopefully to make it more digestible and fun and interesting for people to want to learn. And that's me, Dr. Wilf.
Hi, my name is Einat Wilf. I'm from Israel, born and raised in Israel. I was a member of the Israeli Knesset, of the parliament, on behalf of the Israeli Labor Party from 2010 to 2013. I used to work with people like Shimon Peres and Yossi Beilin. I've been out of politics in the Knesset for about a decade now. And that time, I've been mostly writing and speaking on issues relating to Israel, the Jewish people, the conflict, the path to peace. And I mostly write and speak and fairly active on Twitter, where I was honored to meet Eric, Captain Allen, and John Aziz. And this is really an honor for me to be here together and hopefully promote our joint vision.
Amazing. Thank you all again for being here. Thank you for introducing yourselves. To everyone listening, this conversation is going to be between the four of us, mostly the three of them, as we talk about how we got here, how we got to October 7th, and a post-Hamas world, what this can look like in the future, the different possibilities. Obviously, there will be little breaks, little questions between those two major ones. And feel free I'll be monitoring all the comments, all the tweets. Feel free to tweet in some questions, and I'll work them in, especially if one gains traction or I see one being asked a lot. I'll definitely be sure to work those in. And that's really how this is going to work. So I can pass the baton to anybody here, but in your views, what led us to the moment of October 7th, when Hamas, as some would say, broke free, as some would say, committed this terrorist act? How did we get here? How did we fail in this way?
Boy, I think that Dr. Wilf has written the most about this, but personally, as being the one Palestinian who's on this chat, I'd actually, if it's all right, be interested to hear what John has to say to sort of start us off, if that's okay.
So, I mean, I think really we have had 75 years of failure. I think it has been failure to grasp opportunities for peace on the Palestinian side. I think it's been failures to grasp opportunities for peace on the Israeli side as well. I think that certainly, I know there have been offers that have been rejected by the Palestinian side. I would say to the Israeli side, well, push your offer a bit further. Right, we need to find a middle ground that we can agree upon. So 75 years of failure in making peace was an important part of the background. But then you had the reality of Hamas controlling Gaza. Hamas's goal is to obliterate, annihilate Israel. You know that they've been using rocket attacks and various other forms of terrorism to do that, and that's why there's been a blockade on Gaza by the Israeli government. Obviously, that's for the civilians in Gaza. That's a horrible thing, and in Gaza and with Hamas, there's been this festering ideology of rejectionism towards Israel, towards the concept that there can be any kind of Jewish state in the Middle East, in Palestine. And I think that was the key motive, really, with the October the 7th attack, was to terrorize Israelis into leaving. This was about saying, you cannot exist here. We do not want you to exist here. You guys need to go and get on planes and leave. And of course, there is elements of mythology around that, such as the Israelis, they're not really indigenous to the land. They're Khazars, or which is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, or they're all from Brooklyn, or they're all we've all heard these theories that Jews are not indigenous to the Middle East and to Palestine. And Hamas really wanted that to happen. They wanted this to be a spark, this flood, the Al-Aqsa flood, where they demonstrate in the most vicious and brutal way, you are not welcome here. And I think that's what Hamas was doing on October the 7th. And I think it has backfired in an incredibly spectacular manner, to be quite honest, because Gaza is being leveled. This is the reality of war. People say, oh no, this isn't war. Hamas is not an army. Hamas is very much an army. Hamas make propaganda videos with them in military uniforms, firing rockets out of rocket batteries. So Hamas's goal was to scare Jewish people into leaving. Their goal is to defeat Israel militarily. Yes, it is to defeat Israel militarily. Maybe they'll be a little bit nefarious and nebulous about what that actually means. And maybe to them it comes down to, we'll survive the Israeli onslaught, right? Maybe that ultimately becomes their definition of what victory means. But yes, they want to defeat Israel. They want to show that they are stronger than the IDF on the battlefield. And they want Israelis to become discouraged in Zionism and to give up on Zionism. And I do not believe that that's what's happened, to be fair. I think lots and lots of Jews are gravitating towards Zionism because they're experiencing, for example, anti-Semitism in the United States, in the UK. And I think that Hamas is failing. I think they've failed the Palestinian people. I think the situation in Gaza is untenable. I think the Palestinian Authority is impotent, right? I mean, I certainly think the Palestinian Authority is a million times better than Hamas. And the situation in the West Bank, as bad as it is, I don't like the occupation. I don't like the checkpoints. I'm not happy with that. But it's a million times better than in Gaza. It's a million times better than in Gaza. But yeah, there's been failure on all fronts, in my opinion. And particularly now from Hamas. Hamas's vision of driving the Jews into the sea has failed the Palestinian people. It has led us into hell. It has led us to the gates of hell. And ultimately, they are going to be removed from power by Israel. That's what I believe.
All right. Dr. Wilf, if you want to transition to you, if you have anything to add to that, whether it be pre-October 7th or pre-2005, if there's anything that you wanted to add during that.
So what I think is remarkable in what John said is that he correctly zeroed in on the goal. A lot of people, when they discuss how we got to October 7th, they look at like the background. And the background is also correct. The notion that ultimately we can discuss details, but there's only one underlying underlying process that led us to October 7th, which is by now almost a century-long ideology that refused to accept a Jewish sovereign state in any borders, in any size, anywhere in this region. So that's the deep goal. And then you could go more for the last 20 years. But Gaza, especially, even more than many other places where Palestinians live, Gaza even expressed this ethos of no Jewish state in any borders even more powerfully, because about 3/4 of the people who live in Gaza consider themselves not as being at home when they're in Gaza, even though they were born there, or their parents, or their grandparents, or by now their great grandparents. They view themselves, despite living in Palestine, in Gaza, as refugees from Palestine. So you have by now several generations who have grown up in Gaza, and this is the vast majority of the population, with the idea that they are living in a temporary place that they should not build and invest in for the purpose of making it a prosperous place. I mean, contrary to all the false maps of Palestine being eaten up, 2005 is the first time that Palestinians actually control territory fully, completely. And because the ideology was not, oh, let's use this territory to build a prosperous city, Palestinian state, to show the world what we can do when we govern ourselves, but rather, since the ideology was first and foremost no Jewish state, Gaza became literally a launch pad from which to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. And every dollar and every sack of cement that entered Gaza, the priority was to use it for Gaza to be a highly effective war machine from which to liberate Palestine. But this is in terms of the background. But the background also gives us, like John said, the vision into the future. A lot of people are looking at what Hamas did and this was planned for 2 years. We know by now, very carefully planned, a lot of strategy, a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, a lot of investments, a lot of infrastructure building that went into it. And a lot of people are, what were they thinking? And they really were thinking, I think, quite clearly and precisely, to strike at the heart of Zionism. For many years, when I gave talks about anti-Zionism, I said that anti-Zionists understand Israel better than anyone, because they understand that the source of Israel's strength are not the tanks or the airplanes or not even the people. It's the idea. And the idea is that the source of Israel's strength, the idea of self-determination, sovereignty for the Jewish people. And if you can bring that idea down, then you bring the entire project. And it also will have theological implications. If you can bring Zionism down, this is a huge win for a certain vision of Islam and the Arab world. So how did they want to strike at the heart of Zionism? By showing that the state of Israel cannot protect its citizens. It could not offer them dignity, that they will be brutalized and massacred and butchered like a pogrom in the shtetl, basically erasing a century of Zionism and saying, look, it did nothing for you. And also by making Jews feel unsafe around the world. And the message is, look, Israel is making you unsafe, and thereby bring the Jewish question back to the fore. And I think they believe that with anti-Zionism, they could get America and the UK and other countries to limit their support for Israel. So ultimately, Israel will not be able to defend itself. And by, this is how Israel will collapse. And I'll just end with this. When I often met over the years with European diplomats over the book, The War of Return, and they would tell me, seriously, the Palestinians don't think there will be return. They don't think Israel is temporary. They understand Israel is here to stay. It's a delusion. And I would always respond, look, if anyone's the irrational in this conflict, it's not the Arabs, it's us. The Palestinians are opening a map. They say, look, 7 million Jews struggling to survive amidst 500 million Arabs, 1.3 billion Muslims. This is not going to last too long. And I think this is the vision behind Hamas's attack on October 7th.
It's very well put. It actually reminds me of a story that Eric told me, but I can let you go and tell that story, I'm sure. just so you know, I'm talking about the professor and the students. We talked about a couple of times. So if you want to jump in here, Eric, and share that story along the way. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I'm sorry.
Well, so there was a professor. I'll tell the story and then I'll let you go. So the professor, Israeli professor with a West Bank Palestinian student.
I know what you're talking about now.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I will tell it. It actually is a name that's many people may know quite well. It's actually Dr. Daniel Gordis, who was one of the lecturers that I had on a couple-month-long trip I did to Israel about 18 years ago, really before Danny Gordis became Danny Gordis. I try to read and watch everything he says and writes, because it's not that I agree with absolutely everything he says. I've never met a human being on the planet with whom I agree with everything, and that's fine. It's because he is passionate and he cares, and he works at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem, and they have a lot of Arab students, Arab Israeli students, and a lot of them he had a lot of respect for and found them to be very thoughtful and interested in learning about the history. And there was one student in particular who was a female Arab Israeli, and she stood out among the rest and just really seemed to be somebody who got it. And Dr. Gordis spoke with her, and he asked the sort of difficult question just to see where it would go, and that really was, where do you see this land ultimately in 100 years or in 200 years? And the answer was always the same from this student and from the remainder, which is what makes John so special, quite frankly, because he doesn't answer this way. And it was, you'll be gone and the land will be ours again. It was, we understand that you're here now. We understand that you have the might to plant yourselves here and that we can't throw you out now, but we threw out the Crusaders and we have all the time in the world. We don't know how long it will take, but eventually you guys will be gone too, because the Jews are simply not seen in the majority. I never like to say all, because obviously it can't be all, but the vast majority of Palestinian society, the Jews are not seen as having any, forget indigenous, any historical claim to the land whatsoever. They're seen as usurpers, as colonialists who came and stole the land. And that is not just a thought. It's not even just a belief. It is part of their identities. It is very difficult to change a person's identity. Being someone who is not just a victim, but an ultimate victim. This is the way that they've been portrayed in the world. It's the way they've been taught, that you had this paradise called Palestine until these foreign Jews came and stole it from you. That is a part of the identity of much of Palestinian culture today. I think the reason that we, hear somebody like John who does not feel that way is largely because you grew up in the United Kingdom and you've had more access. I mean, there is not the same freedom of speech.
Yeah, I'd like to give John a second to maybe push back and add his own perspective here, because I think that is a common viewpoint amongst, I'd say, diaspora Jewish population. So, John, if you have comments or pushback there at all.
I think you're correct to some extent. I think my experiences as a Palestinian are probably vastly different to the majority of Palestinians. I grew up on a university campus, right? And there were, large numbers of Jewish people. Some of my best friends growing up were Jewish people. So I met with Jewish people. I became friends with Jewish people. I've intentionally I've intentionally in my adult life, as someone who's looked at this conflict and wanted to understand how to have a solution, I've intentionally gravitated towards speaking to Jewish people and towards speaking to Zionists. So I fully recognize that I am not typical of Palestinians. I don't speak for Palestinians. I only speak for myself. I'm an independent voice trying to talk about ways in which we can gravitate towards a solution to the long run problem, which of course is people killing each other, which is what I abhor. So yeah, I don't think I'm typical of Palestinians. I will say that my late father did tell me that, living in the West as a Palestinian, you're going to meet lots of Jewish people because we like the same things. I think that was his that was the way he put it. We like the same things. So yes, I think Palestinians in the West do get an opportunity to speak to Jewish people. I think that can be very enlightening. Of course, if you're a person who wants to try and understand both sides of the conflict, I would say that my positions are unconventional. I'm completely willing to admit that. I don't represent any broad Palestinian consensus. I hope that I can be an advocate still for Palestinian interests. I think that's probably my goal, is to advocate for Palestinian interests. So yes, I would say roughly it's correct to say that I'm quite unconventional. But of course, there are Palestinians who are cropping up now, who I'm becoming friends with, who have, maybe they haven't had the same childhood as me, but they can still see some merit in what I'm saying.
Good. That's wonderful to hear. I'll be honest.
John, would you mind expanding a bit on that? Because one of the things that, of course, I always follow is a voice like yours. And as you've noticed, immediately I support and platform. Because my experience is that only things that get said publicly and consistently over time matter. One of the phenomena you have for decades, people tell me, oh, I hear that. They told me that in a closed room. But the only things that really matter over time and that really reflect a shift in a population is when things are said publicly and consistently over time. So when you're saying that people are gravitating to you, what are you hearing? What are you seeing?
Well, I'm seeing multiple Palestinian dissidents who are critics of Hamas, right? Who are talking to me, which is fantastic, and coordinating me. For example, I'm talking to an American Palestinian called Ahmed Fouad Al Khatib, and one of the things he's focusing on is providing food aid to Gazans through unconventional sources such as airdropping it. That's something the Jordanians have done, right? I personally would call upon the leaders of the United Kingdom and the United States and say, we need to cut Hamas out of the picture. We need to, cut a lot of the logistical binds and blockages out of the picture and directly drop food aid on Gaza, as the World Food Program has done in various other places. So I'm meeting people like that, and these will tend to be pragmatic people who want to see a real solution, right? Because you would be crazy to enjoy the status quo. You'd have to be the most deranged masochist on earth to enjoy seeing Palestinians being, defeated and destroyed in the manner that is occurring in Gaza now. So there are pragmatists who like the idea of peace and want to work on realistic pathways towards peace.
But if I may, beyond the pragmatists, they want to look at the food or cut off Hamas. Do you find fellow travelers, because what's unique about you is that you're discussing ideas. You're not discussing specific, okay, how do we do that? You're discussing ideas. You're willing to cut to the core, to look at the key ideas, to look at the notion of a Jewish state. Are you hearing anyone who comes to you and says, the last century that we've spent diverting our resources as a people to making sure that there's no Jewish state have been a waste of time. We need to come to terms that the Jews have a historical claim. They're not foreigners. They're not crusaders. They have the right to self-determination. They won't have it all. We won't have it all, but that should be the basis. I mean, are you hearing anything on that, like in that direction?
Yes, a few. Not a vast upswelling of support for that. But yes, there are. I know Palestinians now who will describe themselves as Zionists.
Really? Okay.
Are any of them living in the West Bank or Gaza?
Probably.
I don't know, because a lot of the times their profiles will be quite ambiguous, because there is a degree
Fair
of
enough.
I will say
there's
on
a
that.
degree of
I do
threat
talk.
in that regard.
I will say on that. I do talk with Palestinians via Twitter, via X, that do live in West Bank or Gaza, and none of them are showing their face, and none of them are, really want to do this very publicly. If they do a space call, it's a space call. It's not a stream face to face, and it's hard. It's hard to get a real accurate count of Hamas support. Actually, one of the sources that I have found that push back on the numbers of 75 to 90% support for Hamas is actually John. When he shares links and sources, like, hey, look at this poll, or look at this source of maybe Gaza isn't all supporting Hamas, and it's hard to find that right now. My hope and belief is that in a post-Hamas world, you could see a drastic change in those polls, and a drastic change in that who's willing to come forward and even show their face in these type of conversations.
I think what I'm doing is pretty difficult, right? I get multiple death threats every week, right? So this is a challenging position. I'm in relative safety in the UK. I don't think Hamas particularly cares about me. I think Hamas has much bigger goals than anything to do with me. I think they're in Gaza fighting a war that's very, very difficult on the ground. But who would want this amount of pushback? Like, I get huge pushback, including from very many Palestinians who very often they strawman me, right? Very often their argument is not John is someone who wants peace and is thinks it's reasonable to come to a peaceful resolution with the Zionists. Very often it's John supports Mia Kahan, right? Or John supports Benjamin Netanyahu, right? So, which is complete rubbish, right? I'm extremely opposed to Mia Kahan, as are most Israelis, by the way. But I'm also, a critic of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu. I don't think that the pro-settlement movement is a realistic pathway to peace. I think that's something that Israelis need to get control over, right? But unfortunately, a lot of people will hear my position and they'll strawman me. So this is a difficult position to take. I'm walking a very difficult line in between, hardcore Hamas supporting Palestinians on one side who basically think I'm a traitor, and on the other side, Zionists who, Netanyahuist Zionists who perhaps are not particularly optimistic that peace can ever happen, and they ultimately want the entire West Bank. So I'm walking a difficult path, and this is a difficult pathway to advocate for. And I think Einat Wilf is probably walking an equally difficult pathway, right?
Oh, no, doesn't even come close. I mean, thank you, but no, you are going against, again, a century-long established ethos that, like Eric said, is part of an identity, which is why people respond in many ways so intensely. By and large, I might cross within Israel between right and left, but I operate within the general Israeli ethos, which speaks about the right of the Jewish people to self-determination and an understanding that given a true opportunity for peace and given the numbers, exercising the Jewish right to self-determination means also dividing the land with its Arab Palestinian inhabitants. So I'm not in a difficult position at all, and I'm not taking any risks. And I mean, so not comparable at all, which is why, again, it's important for me all the time to make sure that your voice is heard.
Yeah, John, I would actually even add to that the ethos, as Dr. Wolf stated, of Israel has been more or less, two-state solution. More or less, we both just want self-determination for our own people. The danger, in my mind, from what I've read in the conversations I had, is as this conflict continues, if it keeps going down the way that it's been going, as your Atlantic article puts, I think at the end of it, Netanyahu's dad said it's basically two AMs going against each other until one gives out. If it keeps going that way, in my mind, the danger is that, well, eventually the Netanyahu, I'd say extremist, whatever you want to say, all radical Zionist, Ben Gvir, eventually that could become the ethos down the line. And I don't know when that moment would happen. But you see it in moments. I mean, there's never been a moment like October 7th in Israel's history, but you see it in these moments where people lose hope. And hope is one of the things to talk about a lot. But that can happen on the Israeli side too. As well, if people just lose hope that the ethos from the other side is never going to change, and it's just we're basically being forced into a position of it's going to be your state or our state, and we're not going to commit suicide here. That's really what I could see. I could see that ethos changing, but I would agree with Dr. Will and Eric that hasn't been the ethos yet, and that's what I personally want to avoid. That's
another thing that I'm trying to push back against, I suppose, because I've seen lots of advocacy on the Israeli side, and I'm sure you'll all condemn these people, but there's lots of advocacy on the Israeli side since October 7th for essentially some sort of ethnic cleansing, where Palestinians, the Jerusalem Post published an article talking about the Palestinians of Gaza need to go to Sinai, right? And whether it's Sinai, whether it's Palestinians need to go to Jordan, the real two-state solution is Jordan. There are advocates within Israeli society, including within the Israeli government, who are pushing various forms of ethnic cleansing. And this is another thing I have to push back against. This is a very difficult pathway to walk, because I don't want anyone to be pushed out. I don't want the Israelis to be pushed out, and nor do I want Palestinians to be pushed out. So if you're a person who wants a reasonable conclusion where we all roughly get to stay, we all roughly get to have self-determination, we all roughly get to enjoy the benefits of economic prosperity, right, and trading with each other, which is one of the things that builds the wealth of nations, you have to push back both against Hamas and against Israeli claims that none of the Palestinians want peace, so they have to be ethnically cleansed. So I have to sort of swing my sword on both sides, and I got myself into this because it's something I felt passionately about. But this is not an easy path, right? It's not an easy path. I get enjoyment from feeling like I'm doing something that will be beneficial for the Palestinian people and will be beneficial for the people of the Middle East and the people of Earth and humanity in general. So I'm very excited about that part of this role that I've chosen to take on. But it's not an easy role at all. It's not an easy role at all, because there are extremists on both sides who want to push the other one out. And it is like that analogy, for the unfortunate analogy from Mr. Netanyahu's father, about two goats on a bridge. And I don't want to be two goats on a bridge. We can be friends. If we really respect each other, if we really have compassion and empathy for one another, we could be friends.
If I might jump in at this moment, if that's all right, I'd like to address both what you said, and then I'd also like to tie in sort of my take on the very first question that was asked about how we ended up where we are, because I think there's also one more avenue that we have not addressed that led us to this point. So the first thing I'm going to do is address what you were just saying right now about certain extremists that exist in Israeli society. Yes, of course. Okay. There's not a society on the planet that doesn't have its, I'm just going to say it, it's scumbags. We might disagree on who those scumbags are, but no, we're not a hive mind. If anything, we are the most argumentative people on the planet. What I will tell you is, Israel went through, 5 elections in 2 years. And what you are seeing right now, the government, before Benny Gantz recently joined it after October 7th, is not really a government that is very representative of the people of Israel. Don't forget that Israel is really a straight up parliamentary system. You just have to get 3% of the vote in order to, be in the Knesset, and you just have to have a coalition. You just have to have a majority by 1 seat to create a government coalition. And what happened is people's turned on Netanyahu, and you can say it for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. I'm not here to judge that. I try to stay away from politics and try to stay into history and the law. But what I will tell you is there were simply people who would have been natural partners in a government who refused to join a government where Likud would be run by Benjamin Netanyahu, whereas had it been anyone else, they would have. You could have very easily seen a stable government in Israel for the last several years under somebody else from Likud that would have joined into a government with Benny Gantz, with Yair Lapid, with Gideon Sa'ar, some very strange things have happened over the last couple years. And let's not forget that this government that exists now also followed a government that was the most far-reaching in terms of far left to far right, and included an Arab party in it for a year in the ruling coalition, the Ram party under Mansour Abbas, because that was the only way that a coalition could be made, with Naftali Bennett and with Yair Lapid. And what's interesting to me is, people tend to ignore that year. Israel was not given a pat on the back for having an Arab party as part of the ruling coalition, or having a much more left-leaning. It has just been, it's just always been Netanyahu, and now look, it's the most right-wing government. And here's how I want to tie it into, how I see that we got here to October the 7th. And I do like to look at things in a historical perspective, and I'm not going to go as far back as I normally do. Instead, I'm going to start at 2000. I'm going to speak about 2005, and then I'm going to speak about very briefly what happened between then and October the 7th. And the bottom line is this: I believe that the Israelis have ultimately shown that when they feel that there is a legitimate chance for peace with the Palestinians, or really with any Arab country, whether that be Egypt or Jordan, even at times with Syria, although it did not work out, that the Israelis will vote in a government that will seek to achieve that goal. That's what you had with Ehud Barak in 2000. It was, we've got Bill Clinton, we've got Ehud Barak, and we had at least the words in English coming from Yasser Arafat that were seemingly more moderate and of the appearance that a two-state solution was a real possibility. And I think that everything really changed after that in a way that Israeli society has not yet recovered from, and that it may take generations for Israeli society to recover from. And after October the 7th, it may take yet another generation. And what I mean is, the Camp David and Taba, and with the Clinton parameters, the Palestinians were ultimately offered just about everything they ever asked for. It was, by the time we got to the Clinton parameters, I believe 97% of the West Bank, 100% of the Gaza Strip, and with some land swaps for the other 3% to make sure that, because those were just established big communities. It's kind of ridiculous to call them settlements at this point. They are full, large communities that exist, but there would be land swaps to make up for that land. They would have East Jerusalem as their capital. But ultimately, Arafat didn't even say no. He just did not respond. He just let the clock run out. And you can read Bill Clinton's memoirs in a book called My Life, and he places all of the blame on Arafat for it. We know that the Saudis, I can't remember the name of the Saudi who said it, but it was a very influential Saudi who came out and called it a crime that Yasser Arafat turned down that deal. Those Clinton parameters were accepted by the Israeli Knesset. Wow. It was a time that if he had said that, we could be right now in the 23rd year of the Palestinian state. It was that close. And it's not just that Arafat said no, but it's that we now know from the research that's been done, the papers that were recovered from Arafat's office, the Palestine papers, that were leaked and all that Arafat ultimately was never going to make peace, that he was a revolutionary, that he saw himself as, he was siphoning billions that were being given to his people, that his goal was to replace Israel, not to live side by side with Israel. And ultimately, he was a big part of kicking off the Second Intifada. And I think that the Second Intifada left scars that most people around the world today looking at this conflict don't quite understand. It was 5 years of almost daily suicide attacks. It was families who didn't want to travel anywhere together because they didn't want, the mothers and fathers would not go to dinner together because what if a bomb blew up the restaurant, their child would be left orphaned. This is the way they lived for 5 years. And this is also what created, the modern, if you think about the people who are chanting in the streets, this younger generation, they don't really know much about that. I mean, it's 23 years ago now. They're mostly younger than that. Or, if they're a little bit older than that, they certainly don't remember it. But the bottom line is, there was no security fence. You can call it a wall if you want, separating the West Bank, Judea and Samaria from, Israel proper, whatever you want to call it. That was put in place because of the Second Intifada, because of the daily suicide attacks. And no matter how easy it is to look and say, we need to build bridges, not walls, man, that security barrier saved lives. In the year before the security barrier, there were over 1,000 terrorist attacks. In the year after, there were 3. You can't deny the effectiveness. That's when there were the checkpoints. That's why they went into place. It wasn't because of racism. It wasn't because of racial profiling. It wasn't because of, we don't like or trust the Arabs or the Palestinians or whomever. It was people are dying. How else are we supposed to stop this from happening, but have checkpoints to search? And that today's Palestinians very easily can not understand that because they weren't around for, don't remember, because it's a very young society, the Second Intifada. And to them, it's just nothing but, an oppressive sort of rule. And to the rest of the world, it's easy to look at and point, and just because Americans like to see everything through an American prism, oh, that must be racism, because that's what we understand. We understand things through the prospect of racism, even though the Middle East has a very different history than the United States of America. That is the understatement of the century. But what I want to say, just finally to wrap this up really is, it was 2005 as the Second Intifada was finally coming to a close, that Ariel Sharon, somebody who was considered as far right a prime minister that Israel had ever before had, decided that, well, even the left-wing parties, even the Labour Party was unable to make peace. I don't feel that we have a peace partner on the other side, but we also don't want to rule over millions of Palestinians. So let's disengage from Gaza. That will be sort of a trial run. We'll see what happens. And the Israelis did that. And it wasn't just, let's disengage, let's take the military out. No, they uprooted settlements. Jews were forcing Jews out of their homes in an area that, while you can certainly call it Palestine, Gaza, Palestinian land today, it was a part of, ancient Israel. And Jews were forcing Jews out of that land. And that had a symbolic difficulty to it that was hurtful to Israeli society to watch it happen. There were soldiers that, the settlers were, wanting to hit them and getting angry with them, and they would be hugging and crying because they knew that they had to do it because Israel is a nation of laws, but it was painful, but they did it anyway. And they didn't just dismantle the settlements. They didn't just take out the living Jews. They dug up the graves. They moved dead Jews out of Gaza. There was not a single Jew left in Gaza after 2005, alive or dead. And they left infrastructure in place and handed the keys over to the Palestinian Authority. The greenhouses that they left in place, those were worth many tens of millions of dollars for the economy, and they were just ransacked and destroyed shortly after Israel's disengagement. But it was within, I think, 2 weeks of Israel's disengagement, Hamas fired 40 rockets at Sderot. But, you know, there was no blockade then, don't forget. You know, Israel was giving this a chance. It was, I think, about a year and 9 months later that there were the elections. And unfortunately, the Palestinians voted for Hamas. And suddenly Israel was in a situation where they had a terrorist entity whose charter says explicitly it's their goal to destroy the state of Israel and to commit genocide of Israel's Jews and of Jews around the world. That it is because it is a extremist Islamist organization that believes that this land was once Islamic and therefore it must always be Islamic, and that believes that Islam replaced Judaism and Christianity, and therefore it is simply an affront to Islam that Jews should ever be masters of their own domain in this land. And so, you know, it didn't even happen with the blockade right away from there. But once the bloody coup took over, where all of Fatah and PLO were kicked out of Gaza in 2007, you know, and it was bloody. I mean, they were throwing Fatah members from the roofs of buildings in Gaza. And I mean, that's how Dahlan, Mohammed Dahlan ended up in the UAE. Actually, you know, he was the security head of security for the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, but because he was Fatah, he was forced out. He's been in exile ever since. You know, there are none left. Hamas placed an iron grip over that area, and this was an entity that there was no question was not interested in state building, that they were interested in state replacing, that they were interested in replacing the Jews and destroying the Jews. And it was known that they were already bringing in weapons and, you know, terrorist leaders and things like that. Eventually, a blockade of some kind needed to be put in place because Israel is a tiny country. You can see how much damage they did even in small kibbutzim. If they're able to reach the large population centers in Tel Aviv, you're putting millions of Jews at risk. And how good of a blockade was it really? Let's not forget that one border is controlled by Egypt, not by Israel at all. And Egypt certainly enforced.
Eric, I'm gonna cut you short here a little bit. Because I think that's a good stopping point. I agree with where you were going to. That part does kind of boil my blood too, but I think it's a good stopping point for how did we get here. I think 2000 is a natural. I mean, obviously we can go back hundreds of years if you want to. We can go like 75 years, but I think 2000 is a good place to like, hey, this is kind of where Hamas got introduced, really into the main picture. And
Troy, if I could say one last thing, because it's really where I was about to end, and I want to end on it. It's just that, you know, the first Israel-Hamas war after the disengagement was 2008, Operation Cast Lead. The world has been stopping Israel from taking out Hamas since then. The best Israel has been able to do is manage the conflict, has been to accept a status quo where Hamas is still in power, but is able to do as little damage as possible. Nobody thought on October 6th that Hamas was capable of doing what they did on October the 7th. And that is the final point that I want to make here, is that I believe that it's not just Palestinians or Israelis who need sort of a smack in the face wake-up call. It is the international community as well that needs to understand that their support of UNRWA and their getting in the way of Israel doing what needs to be done to have even the possibility of peace has only made things much worse and go on for much longer. And it took an October 7th for Israel to finally do what now unfortunately has to be done. And it's being done at a time in which Hamas has become so entrenched with their, underground tunnels and everything in civilian areas that it's just getting more civilians killed than ever would have been previously. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for
that makes sense. No. I appreciate it. I appreciate the long form. I really do. It did feel like a good natural stopping point, as Michael Elgort, Michael, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. He sent in a message that Salih al-Aruri, a senior leader of Hamas military wing, was just killed, and it seems like a good natural transition point into our second question of, hey, here's how we got here. Obviously, there's hours and hours of detail that we can keep talking about, but maybe the more important part of this discussion is, where do we go post-Hamas? I know a lot of Palestinians that I talk to say that's a dream, that there is no post-Hamas. I think we're watching it happen live. I think they're the ones kind of that need to wake up there. But I love what you just added there at the end, the international community. That's something that needs to be talked about too in a post-Hamas world. It's blind support for UNRWA and just the UN's, in my opinion, bigotry. There's a lot of steps that need to be taken. So let's get into that part of the discussion of, what does a post-Hamas world look like? How do we achieve peace? Because the other possibilities, none of us want anymore. So I'm happy to hand off to Dr. Will for anyone that wants to take the baton here.
Sure. Well, once we understand how we got here, and that the battle has always been about the question of whether there can be a Jewish state in the land, in any border whatsoever. And the reason that there's never been a symmetry here is because, at the end of the day, the Jews are destined, damned, depending on your perspective, to be an ethnic, linguistic, national, and religious minority in an Arab and Muslim world. That is why also all the discussions of Palestinians will go, and I'm like, we're not an isolated situation here. The Jews are a minority in an Arab and Muslim Middle East, which means always every path to peace will have to depend on acceptance of the idea of Zionism, of a sovereign Jewish state in an Arab and Muslim Middle East. What John said before about what he wants is the humane vision is something that also I often emphasize, that I say the conflict basically ends in one of two ways. Either the Arabs get their way and there's no Jewish state, and then there can be other conflicts in the Middle East, but this one will go away, or the Arabs forgo their anti-Zionism. So either basically Jews forgo Zionism, either in some cataclysmic violent event or basically by giving up, or Arabs forgo anti-Zionism. And I think Arabs forgoing anti-Zionism is by far the more humane way to go forward, because then everybody stays and nobody goes, and there's no violence, and everyone can live side by side, because that's only ever been the problem, the idea that there can be no Jewish state, even in part of the land. So for me, that's the only, call it, ideological path forward. There's a lot of discussions now based on practicalities, doing this. But for me, none of them has any chance of succeeding if we're not addressing the underlying issue. If we're not addressing the fact that, again, the Palestinians are not a people without capabilities. The global notion that they are some charity basket case is terrible. What we saw on October 7th, if anything, is massive investment in infrastructure, strategy, planning, finance and trade, everything. It's just that all of these remarkable capabilities have been channeled to destruction of what other people have built, rather than to build for themselves. So for me, the question has never been whether there's enough money flowing or enough aid, or the question was, are the Palestinians at this point in history where they're finally saying, we're done with our century-long battle with Zionism, we want to live next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it? And do we have a world that is willing to stop indulging the notion that there's any other problem except very destructive priorities? So for me, that's the only way to go forward. I sometimes call it Arab Zionism or Muslim Zionism or Palestinian Zionism. And I'll just say with that, sometimes I'm in a panel, I was in panels, and I would say, look, the only major obstacle to peace is, there's others, but the obstacle is the denial of the Jewish right to self-determination in any part of the land. And then sometimes I would have someone more to the left of me would say, what, you expect the Palestinians to be Zionists? And people think it's like some really like big own. And then I say, yes. And then people kind of giggle. And I say, look, Israelis are correctly expected, as the price of a kind of peace, to say that they support the Arab-Palestinian right to self-determination in the land. Why is it so preposterous to expect the Palestinians to support and acknowledge the Jewish right to self-determination in the land, aka Zionism? So I think once there is that, all the other issues fall into place. They become details.
I can jump in there. I completely agree, obviously, but for me, I've never seen, and maybe it's just because where my education came from. I started studying this topic heavily 3-4 years ago. I've never seen the Palestinians as a charity case, so to speak. I've always just known or learned that these are very educated people. It's a very educated community and culture. It's in so many ways very similar to the Jewish culture, the Jewish community, the Israeli community. I've always seen that overlap there personally. For me, like, my biggest grievance, and I think the main thing that keeps that ethos, that general ethos in place that you're talking about, Dr. Wilf, is the outside world. It's that they've almost, it's weird to say this, but I really do believe it. They've almost turned anti-Semitism into a weapon that destroys the Palestinian people. They've used it in a way that it's just, hey, we're going to continue our own fight for our own purposes and just force this ideology onto the Palestinians. And when you're in Palestine, I talk to people in the West Bank, which mostly right now is in the West Bank, not as much in Gaza. They see the rallies around the world, and they just think, oh, our causes must be righteous, it must be good, because look at all the support around the world. And in actuality, it's gas the Jews, it's kill the Jews. They're protesting outside a random Jewish bakery, or they're protesting Starbucks for some wild reason no one's ever actually been able to explain to me. And it's a weapon. It's crazy that Palestinians have become the first people, other than the Jews, to have to deal with anti-Semitism. And that's, for me, is like the hardest part of getting to where we need to be. Because I agree with you, there needs to be an ethos change, just a general acceptance of, hey, we want to live side by side. But when the entire world is telling you, no, you don't want to do that, that's not what you want, it's hard to ignore that. It's hard to, as human beings, it's like, well, if everyone thinks this, right? And so I'm with you there. John, looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, so I mean, to go back to something that Eric said about the Sharon unilateral withdrawal in 2005, I think we can all probably agree that that was a complete failure. And I think, in my opinion, one of the key elements to why it was a failure is because those elements of Palestinian society that we refer to as Hamas, the Islamist, anti-Zionist rejectionists, they have been empowered and helped along the way with arms and with money by groups like Iran and groups like Qatar. And I think when you have a unilateral withdrawal, that creates something like a power vacuum. And I think in the future, if there's going to be any sort of withdrawal, it needs to be mediated with the international community and with parts of the international community that want to see peace and don't want to see, militant anti-Zionism taking over. Because if the international community that wants to see peace does not step in to help the relatively few Palestinian leaders who want to have peace, believe me, Iran and Qatar will continue to support people like Hamas 2.0, right? Because I think Hamas is, going to be dismantled, but there will be Hamas 2.0. There will be probably Hamas 3.0 unless we actually achieve peace. I think the areas in which during the previous peace negotiations where we fell down, it was particularly on the claimed Palestinian right of return, and it was probably also on demilitarization. And I think we probably need to have some sort of compromise on both of those areas where we can sort of figure out a ground that will be acceptable to both Israelis and Palestinians. And if I was the negotiator, I would be very, very happy to talk about that and very happy to advance a case for where we can find a middle ground. Obviously, we're not in a peace negotiation right now. I would very much like to be, and I hope that future negotiators are, getting ready, because I think it is possible in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line that we will be able to see peace negotiations like Camp David, and we will be able to solve the areas where there were disagreements in the past. But for me, it's incredibly important that the international community works with the Palestinians who want to see peace, because if they don't, Iran will be back.
Yeah, and I think that what you just said there is a major part of this, is that the Palestinians have been encouraged in and rewarded for an intransigent position of trying to impose a Palestinian state as opposed to negotiate one, what they're calling lawfare, trying to take Israel to the international, criminal court, joining all these different, but basically doing it through the UN, even though UN General Assembly resolutions have absolutely no legal effect whatsoever. They have the effect of having an air of respectability, of actually having some truth to it, of giving some international legitimacy to it. And when the United Nations is focusing so much of its time on condemning Israel and making Israel out to be the pariah state, not North Korea, not Iran, not China, not Russia, not Mauritania, where there's still modern day slavery, no, just Israel, just the one Jewish state. I think that is a problem that I don't know if it has a solution, because you have an automatic majority against Israel that exists at the UN. I think that there are bad institutions in place right now, unfortunately. And so that's why I think that those who should be involved in determining the future of this land need to be more realistic players in the region, the ones who see the real enemy as Iran, which is the reason really that the Abraham Accords, gained as much steam as they have. And if you get Saudi Arabia involved, as well, because Saudi Arabia is well aware that if Iran gets a nuke, that nuke is not just for Tel Aviv, it is also for Riyadh. So I think that there needs to be regional cooperation that maybe even cuts out the Europeans and maybe even some of the Americans, depending on what the American position is going to be. This idea that we have to immediately move into the two-state solution, while maybe that's where we end up, it sounds ludicrous to just about anybody on the ground now who's an Israeli or a Palestinian. It just seems like people who are sitting comfortably in their chairs thousands of miles away saying, here's what you need to do, but they're not actually dealing with reality. And the final thing that I'll just say really quick, on this is, it's interesting what you said about 2005 and the disengagement being a failure and how it needs to happen through negotiations. And I agree with you completely. But don't forget, there are still people today, tens of thousands of them around the world, who are marching through the streets. They're just saying, end the occupation. I mean, that's what Israel did, right? In Gaza, they ended the occupation, and this is what they got. I mean, people just have a very simplistic view of the conflict and don't understand that if Israel were to even go back to, the 67 lines, and boy, that's not a real thing. There were 49 armistice lines, which, legally were not borders, but regardless, even if Israel went back to those tomorrow, that would not end this conflict. And instead, Israel would be left with being 9 miles wide at its thinnest point. And what happened in Kfar Aza and Kibbutz Be'eri and places like that could all of a sudden happen in places like Tel Aviv and Netanya and Jerusalem. It's basically asking Israel to commit suicide, that Israel cannot trade land for the hope of peace, that it can only trade for peace treaties with an actual change in attitude and with desire and the hope to live in a way that they can help one another to prosper. I mean, that's what you said.
Right.
That's what it should be about. I mean, and that's what the original hopes, of Zionism were for that. Now, maybe they were just idealistic, but that was, the original hope of the Herzls and the even the Jabotinskys. You know what I mean? Even though he foresaw more of an ultimate battle down the line, the idea was it was not we're here to replace these people and kick them out. It was we can prosper together. And the bottom line that I'll say, and then I'll pass it along here, is the one thing that everybody, I believe, needs to come to terms with is the Israelis, the Jews, they're not going anywhere ever. They don't have another place to go. And B, the Palestinians aren't going anywhere ever. This is their home too. That's the bottom line. So the question is, how do we live together in a way that is fair, in a way that is just, that allows for self-autonomy, for self-determination, in a way that allows each generation to have the hope that their children might actually have a future that's better than their past?
So I want to say something about the role of the world, because I think in many ways this is the tragedy and also the biggest question mark about the ability to go forward. Because we have to admit that at the end of the day, the global interest in this conflict that even now remains on a scale, just a small conflict. It's not globally, it's not an important conflict. The only reason that it's ever captured so much attention is because of the role that this land and the Jewish people play in the theology, the imagination, the culture, and the history of all the Christian-based civilizations, so from the Soviet to America, and in the Muslim world. Not so much in China or Japan. I mean, clearly, so whenever, by the way, over the years, when I would meet with Japanese or Chinese delegations to Israel during that moment, they would always like, why is this so interesting? Why are so people obsessed with it? There was always like this notion of like, but if you're living in a society that was based on Christianity, or a society that was at its substructure Islam, then you have millennia of some level of obsession, concern, relationist theology with Jews. And that's the only reason why this conflict has ever been interesting. Now, what happened is that the Palestinians were therefore made into some kind of synergistic, awful situation, into the receptacle of every anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist power in the world. So in the 30s and 40s, it was the Nazis. And this is not like some personal issue on the Muftis. In the war, the Arab Palestinian side in the Arab world is clearly on the side of the Nazis. And the battle against the Jews is in that context. And then it's the Pan-Arabism and the Soviet Union. And then it becomes jihad, Sunni jihadism with bin Laden and so forth. And then it becomes, like John said, Shiite jihadism right now that is happy to support the Palestinian cause. And you're seeing the rise of what I call Western communism, known as woke, but that's, I think, what it mostly is. And all of them are just happy to go in because it gives them just this wonderful cover for their ideology, as if it's about Palestinian rights or anything of the sort. But it's this synergy between local Arabs who wanted perhaps to fight a growing population, and suddenly realizing that they can tap into this rich vein of global support that is interested in supporting them precisely because they are the spearhead of fighting against the Jews. And that's what is being tapped into. And my favorite thinker on societies in crisis, René Girard, says that societies in crisis ask two questions: what to do and who to blame. And the Palestinians have had numerous moments of crisis where they could have asked themselves what to do. And generally, societies that ask what to do, they move forward and they get out of the crisis. And societies that ask who to blame generally remain in the crisis and become collapsed and failed societies. So Palestinians had numerous crises where they could have asked what to do, and say to themselves, you know what? Fighting against the Jews, that has been a failed idea. Let's see how we can divide the land, but that's a failed idea. But every time that they could have asked what to do and move forward, you had these global ideologies telling them in this kind of destructive synergy, no, 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 you don't need to ask what to do. You only need to ask who to blame. And it is the Jews, the Zionists, who are responsible for your misfortune. So you need to change nothing, which is why, again, if we are to get out of this, any kind of change has to be by connecting Palestinians with pro-Zionist ideologies, because if they will continue to be supported by the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic ideology of the moment, we're stuck.
I think one of the biggest problems is the lack of understanding of what Zionism actually is. I think that there's a lot of people in the West in particular who hear the word Zionist and they hear a bad word. It's shocking to me. I mean, it's hurtful to me. I mean, I hear it from very well-meaning, well-intentioned people. They think it's a right-wing ideology. They think that it's a militaristic ideology. They think that it's a religious ideology. They think that it essentially, from my experience, mainly it's believed that Zionism is a belief that God gave the land to the Jews and only the Jews, and therefore this land is the Jews and nobody else can live here, and that it's, racial or Jewish supremacist or whatever you want to call it. And that's not what Zionism is at all. Zionism, very simply was the, national liberation movement of the Jewish people. It's simply the belief that Jews, like any other normal people on the planet, have the right to self-determination in at least a part of their ancient homeland. That's really all it is. And so when you say, Dr. Wilf, that there needs to be pro-Zionist Arabs and pro-Zionist Palestinians, I agree with you, but people need to know what Zionism is, because that's why they're giggling. That's why they're laughing, because they don't understand what Zionism is, and they think that you're trying to manipulate them and tell them that Zionism is something that it really isn't. Because let's not forget also that, as much as I don't want to get into politics too much, there is something to be said for even just the last several years in terms of the way that red versus blue in America has become, so pervasive, and it has become such a fracture in society. And at the end of the day, no matter what you think about Donald Trump's policies or his personality, some of his policies were considered very pro-Israel. And therefore, for the crowd, which makes up a significant percentage of people in America, and particularly on universities, who believe, I'm going to just say it like this, like a caveman on purpose, Orange Man bad. Therefore, anything Orange Man support, also bad. That's the problem. If Zionism, if getting out of the JCPOA Iran deal, if all of that is associated with one of the most divisive people, regardless of what you think of him, it was what always concerned me. I was one who appreciated a lot of the policies that Donald Trump put into place when it came to recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, when it came to moving the embassy, etc. But I always knew that it was going to come at a price because of how divisive he was personally. And so what I'm ultimately saying is people almost need to start with learn what Zionism is first, because otherwise we're talking past each other. We are having conversations that use the same exact words, but we mean something completely different.
Let me speak to this a little bit,
please.
So my general point of view here actually is probably that Palestinians don't really need to become Zionist or even pro-Zionist. All Palestinians need to do is to accept peace with the Zionist state. I don't think that Palestinians need to love Israel. I don't think Palestinians necessarily even need to like Israel. You know, the British and the French don't necessarily like each other, right? But we can coexist peacefully. So I would say that it's incredibly important from my perspective to say that I don't necessarily think that Palestinians need to become Zionists. Certainly, there are some Palestinians who would describe themselves as Zionists. Personally, from my own perspective, I tend to describe myself just as a Palestinian who wants to make peace with the Zionists. Right, because calling myself a Zionist is invoking all of these complicated historical narratives and bringing a whole load of things down on my head and a whole load of debates. Which, when it's just from my perspective, it's just easier to say, let's make peace, because I do not want to be a weapon that's being wielded by global anti-Semites against Jewish people. That's a disgusting concept to me, to be quite honest. And I think in this discussion, we have a wonderful opportunity to take away the richest and most widely used source of motivation for anti-Semitism, which is this conflict. If we can take that away, I think that would be incredibly helpful. If there's peace, it would probably shut up a lot of the anti-Semites. Or I accept anti-Semitism as something that changes and evolves over the centuries. I don't think it's ever going to go away. But I think taking away the anti-Semites' biggest weapon, which is the Palestinian people, which they're trying to use to hit Jewish people over the head with, I think that would be a wonderful thing, and that's why my perspective will always be focusing on peace and focusing on making peace with Zionism.
Can I ask a simple question? Do you support the Jewish right to self-determination in part of the land?
Yes.
So it's the reason I'm joking is that there's a great phrase, I think by Gloria Steinem, that says that people oppose feminism either because they don't know what it is or because they very much know what it is. So when I was a member of Knesset, and sometimes as soon as a woman would get elected to any high position, she would get asked, "Are you a feminist?" And a lot of women would balk and they'd be like, "Look, I don't consider myself a feminist. Of course, I support the equal right for men and women." And I would be like, "You're a feminist." but it's and you're right. As part of the battle against ideas, often ideas get smeared. And the reason, for example, that my Twitter handle says clearly feminist, Zionist, atheist, yes, is because what I've learned over the years is to actually insist on those names, because those titles, those names, they are not maligned by chance. So, John, when you say, if I have to talk about Zionism, I have to take a full baggage with me that I don't want to, and I completely understand that. My argument is that, and I'm not putting it for you to have this battle, it's a battle that I'm waging. The baggage did not happen by accident. The baggage was intentionally built over decades through a strategy that I've come to call the placard strategy, by equating Zionism with every evil in the world. Zionism equals racism, equals colonialism, equals apartheid. And it's a very effective strategy. And then you have a young person who's 18. They don't know that this strategy has been operational for at least 60 years. And they think it just happened right now, and they think it's because of Netanyahu, and they don't understand that they're actually being subjected to a package that is several decades old. And I remember that when a pollster, for me, the battle began and ultimately led to We Should All Be Zionist as a book. The battle began when, more than a decade ago, some pollsters said, we should stop using the word Zionism. It became toxic. Now, this was a pollster. He checked. He saw that the word was toxic. He was like, don't use it. And I remember that's when my battle began. I was like, absolutely not. Because if we forgo that, it's not by mistake. People have invested decades in trying to make Zionism toxic. This goes back to my explanation of what Hamas were thinking on October 7th. Hit at the core of Zionism, and the Zionist entity, the Jewish state, will collapse. So we can't forego that. And for me, the only way to build peace is to go in the exact direction, is to make it clear that the more Arabs and Muslims and anyone around the world becomes a Zionist in the sense of simply supporting the Jewish right to self-determination in part of their homeland, the more we're likely to get to peace.
I think we just need to have that definition out there because people don't get it. There's a great clip online of Noah Tishby on the campus of UC Berkeley, and she is being just screamed at by people who do not want to listen to her at all. And at one point, she gets one, I'll say kid, to be quiet long enough for her to just ask the question, do you believe the Jews have a right to live? The same question you just asked. Do you believe the Jews have a right to live with self-determination in at least some part of the land? And he said, yes, of course. She says, congratulations, you're a Zionist, welcome. And his face dropped. He didn't know what to do. He was just frozen. It's a wonderful moment in what was otherwise an extremely frustrating and difficult video to watch, and to know that that's happening in quote unquote my country. So I do think that that is a problem, that words, and this is, a lot of people call it the post-truth era, the alternative facts era. It's an era where, people are redefining terms. Suddenly Israel could be considered apartheid. Excuse me? What about Israel's like South Africa? Are you kidding me? Suddenly Israel can be accused of genocide. Excuse me? We know a little something about genocide. If the Jews wanted to commit a genocide, they've certainly had the military power and ability to do so for at least the last 6 decades. And yet the Palestinian population has gone up 6-fold. They wouldn't be having troops on the ground right now conducting operations that are getting Israeli soldiers killed. They would simply be dropping bombs. And that's not what's happening right now. The fact that civilians die in war is a horrible thing, and war should hopefully one day be over. In the words, of both Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, no more war. Yes, agreed. That's what everybody wants ultimately. But when there's a reason for that, it's because war is ugly, war is horrible, and civilians have always suffered disproportionately in war. That is just a fact of history.
From my perspective, just to engage what Dr. Wolf said, I think I have a hard enough task getting Palestinians to accept peace with the Zionists. let alone ever convincing Palestinians to call themselves Zionists. I think if anyone can do that, that is a difficulty level beyond anything I could personally ever do. But
I put it out. You're right, and I put it out there as a vision. The reason, by the way, that I insist on it, and again, it's not on you. It's something that I think is for me, as Israelis, as Jews. I think for too long we were willing to accept low standards and to look the other way. We kind of said, okay, that's the most we could expect. That's what we're going to live with. So, for example, as a result, we agreed to call what we have with Egypt peace, but by no standard is it peace. Egypt is the #1 producer and promoter of anti-Semitic content in the Arabic language. Together with Jordan, they're the most hostile nations in international bodies against Israel. There's no cultural connection, no tourism, barely any diplomatic relations. It's a very good no war essentially agreement, but it's not peace. And so part of what I'm trying to change, and again, I'm putting it on you, but it's not, it's for us. Part of what I'm trying to change is, because we know that things are difficult for the other side, we often take several steps back. Okay, so we won't ask them to say that, and we won't ask them to do that. And so I think, at least as a vision, And this is also why I insisted on being very clear that I called the book "We Should All Be Zionists," and it's not just for Jews, it's for everyone, because I really think that the idea of supporting the self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland should be a no-brainer. I insist on calling it by its name. And I do want, as much as I can, to at least have a vision. Like John, you said, you're getting a lot of flack, but you have a vision and you're trying to push to that place. In the same way, I'm saying I have a vision. I know right now there's not a lot of partners for that, but at least I want to put it out there as a contra to this very established tendency among Israelis and many Jews to say, don't ask that, it's too much. Don't put that. And I want to go back to like making demands, having standards.
Of course, the difficult thing, if you flip the question, is you'd have to ask Israelis if they consider themselves to be Palestinian Arab nationalists, and I think you'd have a very difficult time getting many Israelis to say that they're Palestinian nationalists by the same token.
Yeah,
it's interesting. Way. Is that how you perceive it?
Yeah.
I would say that I would say that that's probably.
I mean, the loudest voices aren't always the popular ones.
I think polls show that historically there's been a lot of support for a two-state solution, but I'm not sure Israelis would have called themselves Palestinian Arab nationalists, just as they probably wouldn't call themselves Jordanian nationalists or Egyptian nationalists.
Okay, it's interesting. The reason I see it differently is that. First of all, really just supporting the Jewish right to self-determination is being a Zionist. So in that sense, but I don't, and even the definition, making peace with Zionists is fine. But the reason that I think for Israelis, you say, okay, I support the Palestinian right to self-determination. There is a sense, and that also goes back to what you said about return, is that the Palestinian national movement had never prioritized a Palestinian state if it meant that the Jewish state can also live. And that's the problem. The question is kind of, what is that? And maybe that's an opportunity also to discuss. You're right. The reason all peace negotiations failed is because of this idea of a right of return, but simply because right of return was always just a code name for no Jewish state. So in that sense, there can be no compromise on that idea. Can there be compensation? Can there be discussions? All of that, those are easily solvable issues. But as long as the idea of perpetual refugeehood, an individual, non-negotiable, perpetual right of return into the state of Israel that supersedes Israeli sovereignty, that is an idea that with which there cannot be a negotiation. So we need to differentiate between the idea, which has to go away. There's actually no right of return in any legal sense, in the sense of like a right to settle in Israel that supersedes Israeli sovereignty. There's no such right. So that idea just has to be acknowledged, that there's no right of return in that sense. But can there be mechanisms of compensation, discussions, agreements? Absolutely.
Yeah, I think Palestinians would struggle to give up on some of the UN resolutions that did say that the refugees should return. This being said, realistically, our negotiation can't be solely based upon a UN resolution. It has to be based upon what is going to be acceptable in a negotiation between the Palestinians and between Israel. And of course, that's going to be a compromise somewhere in between. And is it going to involve some level of financial compensation? I would say that that's probably the most reasonable route to take.
You understand, of course, that there are, this is not a small amount there. I mean, you can go to UNRWA schools in the West Bank and Gaza, in places that are entirely run either in Gaza by Hamas they were run, or in the West Bank in entirely Palestinian Authority controlled areas, where if you interview younger kids who never stepped foot in Israel their entire lives, they're almost more radical than their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who may have ever even lived there, because they've been brought up with this ideology. They do not see themselves as living in their land now. The whole point is not return to Ramallah, not return to Hebron, not return to Nablus, not return to Gaza. It is return to Jaffa, it is return to Haifa, it is return to Beersheba, it is return to the Galilee. That they can tell you stories in intimate detail about these homes in this paradise that existed before the Jews came along and stole it. That this is a part of, it's more than just a narrative, it's an identity. And that's why when we say, just a post-Hamas, like the thought that there is going to be a movement toward a quick peace, a quick solution, needs to be dispelled immediately. And that's not a bad thing. People need to learn to be patient with this. They need to learn that incremental improvements are a good thing, that getting more people involved in whether it's Israeli Arabs, whether it's Emiratis, whether it's Saudis, whomever, it shouldn't just be Israelis by any means, but I don't think we necessarily need, the Irish and the Swedes either. But the bottom line is, it may take a generation. It may take two. I mean, I've studied denazification, for example, and I'm not trying to sit here and call the Palestinians Nazis. That's not what I'm doing. But what I'm doing is I'm looking at, what is widely considered to be the standard of a country that went from, one identity that was very destructive to being a member of the group of nations in a positive way. I mean, can you imagine telling a bunch of Jews in the late 40s or even in the 50s that one day one of Israel's best partners and best friends in the world would be Germany? I mean, if anything, that should at least give us a little bit of hope that there's a possibility for a future with Israelis and Palestinians. Now, of course, Israel does not border Germany, and that makes it a little bit easier. But nonetheless, denazification did not just take, and it didn't take very well when it was just Nuremberg trials, which were seen as victor's justice. It really did take a couple of generations to coming to terms with certain things that their parents and grandparents did that were counterproductive, that, in their case, I don't, like I said, I don't want to turn this into, I'm trying to call Palestinians Nazis. I'm not. In their case, coming to terms with the evil that their grandparents had done, and what made it easier ultimately for them was they did not have to feel guilt because they had no personal involvement in it because enough time had passed, but they did feel shame. They looked and they saw what had happened before them. They saw what it led to. And I'm not saying that necessarily the Palestinians need to feel shame, but I am saying they don't necessarily need to feel guilt. What they do need is to acknowledge that their current mode of attempting to end this conflict one way or another has, I think you said, led them to hell. It has certainly not led them to, anything that gives anyone hope that the future generations might be better, unless you are simply, a very religious person who believes that Allah will destroy the Jews and that the Palestinians will take over all of the land. So
if we take Germany out of the picture, because of course Nazi analogies are extremely controversial. I mean, let's look at Japan, right? Japan was defeated in World War II, and they were an independent country legally, almost immediately afterwards. So I know there are differences here. I know that the steps towards peace are going. It's going to be gradual. It's going to be incremental. We have to be realistic, and I have to recognize that both Palestinians and Israelis need to kind of take their time on this to a certain extent. But I think we have to be as optimistic about this as we possibly could be, and as maximalist about this as we possibly could be, in saying that the solution to the Palestinian issue is not being part of Israel. It's its own thing, right? It's Palestinian self-determination. And yes, we need Palestinian leaders who are going to be willing to take the courageous and bold steps to make peace, right? And to say, okay, there is going to be an Israel. It is going to be a Zionist state. We're going to live next to it. We need courage in that respect. And maybe the PLO is kind of hemming and hawing on this issue, and of course Hamas is 100% against it. But Hamas is going to be gone from the picture relatively soon, I believe. I think most probably the IDF are going to achieve their military objectives of removing Hamas from power in Gaza, and then we need to look incrementally as quick as reasonably possible, because the solution is not going to be a one-state solution, because all that will do, it would either be apartheid where the Arabs are denied, or large parts of the Palestinian population are denied Knesset votes, or it is going to be a kind of a free-for-all where there are everyone's voting and it's trying to take control of the state, either for the Zionist vision or the Palestinian vision. I don't think either of those options are good options. I don't think that the one-state solution, which is kind of a demographic battle, is what I want to be in, because that doesn't give any security to either side. Everything's up in the air.
John, just to ask, what would it take to get the people of Gaza to look at Gaza and to look at themselves and say, this is our home, this is where we build our future. We're done trying to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. The Jewish people have self-determination, and we just want to build Gaza for ourselves. We're done using Gaza as a launch pad to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. And which means we're not going to exercise return. We're not fifth-generation refugees. We're Gazan Palestinians who are already home, who are going to build their future where they are. What would it take to get to that place?
A change in leadership supported by countries that want that to happen, plus reforms to the education system. That's probably the most realistic answer to that question. I mean, it's a very kind of, I suppose, long-term visionary question, because of course right now you don't have particularly many Gazans who have that vision. But I think, yeah, Palestinians who want a two-state solution need to be in control. And in Gaza, I think it starts with that, and then it goes to reforms of the education system towards kind of a two-state vision, a respectful mutual coexistence vision, as opposed to a obliterate Israel vision.
But do you think anyone can come today to the people of Gaza? Because my personal belief is that leaders ultimately, even when they're bold, courageous, they operate within the parameters of their people. They can't just have completely crazy ideas. So do you think someone can come today to the people of Gaza and to say, enough is enough, we're done, Gaza is our home, we're not refugees from Palestine, we're in Palestine, we're not going to return anywhere. We now, every dollar that comes in here, every bag of cement, we're going to use it to make Gaza into a prosperous place because our future is here. Okay. I mean, is that something that people want to hear even? I mean,
I think after the war will be a very different environment to before the war. I mean, as Eric's correctly said throughout this discussion, it is, and as you've said, it's almost an essential component to the Palestinian identity. The right of return. We've still got our keys, right? So I think that vision is what inspired October the 7th. It's also what inspired, the previous more sort of non-violent, the Great March of Return, which was sort of Hamas-led as well. Their attempt at a non-violent movement.
Hamas hijacked anyway.
It was literally called, March of Return.
Yeah. So I think it's an essential component to a lot of Palestinian people's identity. So getting people to change that's very difficult. But I think the environment after the war is going to be a very different one, and new ideas will get opportunities to flourish potentially. Because I don't think Gazans are enjoying what's happening right now. They're not enjoying the consequences of October the 7th. I'm not enjoying seeing it. It makes me want peace. It makes me want peace seeing what the consequences of launching that attack on October the 7th are. Right, that makes me want peace even more. I was a sort of low-level peace activist before, and it's kind of forced me to speak more forcefully about it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
That makes sense. I think real quick, as we can wrap up here soon. One of the things that makes me hopeful is that when you look back in 1948, it was really the entire Arab world. It was the Arab-Israeli conflict in a very real sense. and then decade after decade after decade, we got to where we are today. Today, I think, when this war is over, Saudi Arabia could be a really, really big player in going the future of Gaza, which would be insane to say 50 years ago, right? And I think we need to take a step back and look at the big picture. I think we have moved towards peace. I think we are moving in general. If it's like a stock market, I'm not saying it's going in the right direction all the time, but in general, we are moving the right direction. If you take a centuries-long look at it, and at least I hope we are, but that is the way I see it. And as Dr. Wilf said before, the right messages need to be repeated publicly and loudly and often. That needs to happen. That is what's happening here. And I look forward to seeing that happen with all three of you again and again and again. You're always welcome here for conversations like this, one-on-ones, where I can be more of a devil's advocate and push back a bit more. And just whichever way, all three of you are welcome. But I look forward to seeing you on other platforms as well. And just again, as Dr. Wolf said, publicly, loudly, often. That is the way we get to the future. And you're all such a big piece of that in your own way. So I appreciate you all. If there's any kind of final statements you'd like to leave with, I'll open the floor to you now.
There's one thing that I'd like to jump in with, and to the extent that I can also put it out to John and to Dr. Welf, we are, and maybe this is where we'll end up, we are stuck in this idea of it's one state or two state, and in the Oslo framework, that's it. That's the paradigm. And I think that while I cannot predict and I don't have a specific plan for exactly how else it could work, that other plans do exist already. There's Dr. Mordechai Chedar's Emirati plan, which is a very interesting thing to read about and to consider. There have been ideas about confederations, with Israel, with Jordan, with Egypt, things like that. That I think that this is also a time for creativity and for open-mindedness and for incremental steps. I think that just trying to implement what was on the table between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat in 2000, I think it's a pipe dream right now. I think most Israelis, they would never feel safe. I think it's going to be a long time before Israelis would feel safe enough again to agree to something like that. I think that if you talk to an Israeli right now and say we should be implementing the two-state solution, that the vast majority of them are going to look at you like you have six heads. I mean, that's just the feeling right now. And that's not going to be the way it always is. But I do think that it is worth taking this moment, which could be seen, ever as awful as it was, as an opportunity to try something else, to try something new, to allow for new voices, for new ideas to come in, and to, I think that there needs to be a hope given to Palestinian people so that, that's the real big difference between the Germans, the Japanese, and the Palestinians here. Is the Germans and the Japanese knew that they were still going to have a country once it was all over. They just didn't know what it was going to look like. The Palestinians, I think, need to have that same sort of feeling. But I also don't want to pretend that I understand all Palestinians. I know that Arab culture is a much more clannish culture, and that this idea of Palestinian nationalism, while it does exist, it does not necessarily permeate the whole of Palestinian Arab society. It did not exist really much. There was a pan-Arabist movement, and then there were the clans really, in the early 1900s, really all the way up until the mid-60s. And we can see what the result of Western state building has been on the Middle East. You have the failed states like Syria, like Libya, like Iraq, and you have the states that are thriving, like the United Arab Emirates, like Kuwait, like Qatar. These are states that are built on the clan mentality. It's because it's already a built-in structure. You don't have to have this figurehead like a Mahmoud Abbas, who is the leader over an entire people. You have your clan, which goes back, centuries, and the leader of that clan is just simply listened to, and that's the way that it is. Now, I do not know enough about current Palestinian Arab society to say whether or not that makes enough of a difference, but I don't think it should be ignored. And what I'm trying to say ultimately is, one of the big things that Dr. Wilf has always pointed out is that, especially early on, it was when the British were deciding to give up on their mandate over Mandate Palestine. It was the well-known anti-Semite, but the foreign minister and of Britain, Ernest Bevin, who stood up before the House of Commons, I believe it was, and said that the reason that this conflict is irreconcilable is the point of principle for the Zionists is for the Jews to have a state, and the point of principle for the Arabs is for the Jews not to have a state. There was no such thing as trying for a Palestinian Arab state then. It was just to preclude the Jews from having their own state. At some point that changed with some Palestinians, maybe a lot of Palestinians to some degree, to where they also wanted a state, except that I think for the most part they wanted a state instead of Israel. But because at that time I think it was more of a pan-Arabist kind of state than it was a specific Palestinian state. In fact, the first PLO charter actually said we have no a desire for the lands that Jordan occupies in the West Bank, and we have no desire for the lands that Egypt occupies in Gaza. And it was very clear that the PLO made it, I think it was paragraph 24 of their charter, if I'm remembering that correctly, their entire point, it was not the Palestinian Liberation Organization, it was the Palestine Liberation Organization. So it still is. And that meant Israel. Okay. No one for 19 years between 49 and 67, when Jordan occupied the West Bank and actually illegally annexed it in 1950, and when Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, nobody tried to set up a Palestinian state. There was no movement for that. There was no desire for that. There was no push for that. So Palestinian nationalism is a more recent phenomenon, and I don't know the degree to which it is a powerful driver of Palestinian society today. But what I think needs to happen is there need to be a lot of different Palestinian voices, a lot of different Arab voices, a lot of different Muslim voices. I think there need to be Arab Christian voices as well, at the table, who are discussing, all of the different cultural reasons why certain things may work better than others, that we shouldn't be trying to impose a Western solution on the Arab world, because every time we've tried to do that, it hasn't worked out.
So I'll just quickly to close. My sense is always the exact details of how we live side by side for me were never important. The question was, is there finally an Arab-Palestinian willingness to accept the Jews as sovereign? Once that's why I said in the beginning, once that's accepted, everything else is details. Then we can look at what arrangements, how we live, what's the best. But that is the underlying conflict. If that is resolved, everything else can be agreed and negotiated. That's why it's not about the structure. You move from two state to one state. Like John said, it will be moving from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the Jewish-Arab civil war. If you don't solve the underlying question, then all the details don't matter. And if you do solve the underlying questions, the details just fall into place. And I just want to end by saying that, John, anything you can do to encourage those who are talking to you to also talk publicly, to begin to create a sense that there's more of these voices, and that they feel that, because if they feel that they can speak up, it means they feel that they're endangering themselves less by doing so. And because that's the value of public speaking. You publicly speak when you feel that it's not very risky, or it's list a risk you can manage. So the more of these voices we hear, the more we understand that people who are making those claims feel less at risk, which means that a deeper transformation in society is underway, which is why bring anyone you can bring.
I second that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to say, thank you for having me. Thank you to Dr. Wilf and to Eric for sharing the stage with me. It's very interesting to have a conversation with both of you. You're both very distinguished people. I do believe that more Palestinians are going to follow kind of the lead of looking at this conflict in terms of trying to make peace and trying to peacefully coexist. And I think I'd like to end on a note of saying that having a peaceful mentality probably it is more important than the exact details. So I'm agreeing with what Dr. Wilf just said. I think that the mentality of peace and the mentality of compassion for your fellow humans and the recognition that they are equal humans to you, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Arab, whatever it is, right? Whether you're gay, whether you're straight, whether you're a man or a woman, recognizing the humanity of your fellow humans is the message that I want to promote. And I believe that that's the pathway to peace. And I believe that the more of us that do it on both sides, looking at the humans on the other side and saying, we want to live in peace with you, I believe that's the true pathway to peace. And that's the pathway that I'm going to continue promoting.
Good luck to
Amazing.
us all.
I love it. Again, thank all of you. I really appreciate all your time. As
Sure, I
Dr.
just
Wilf
want
was
to make
saying,
sure, sorry, because I did just mention in some of the tweets that we would have a Q&A to the extent that people wanted one. I don't know if people have time for it. I don't want to, hold anybody, but I want to make sure that since I don't know if you've received questions or not, I just wanted people who took their time out of their day to watch us live, if they had an opportunity to ask, for at least some of them to ask a question or two.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I cannot bring them up since we are on a stream.
Okay.
And Space Call, we can bring them up. I do have a few questions here. One recent one, this was actually a little bit ago, but they wanted to ask about the USA's role in terms of financial and military aid. Many anti-Zionists here, including people in Congress, are trying to force the collapse of Israel by withdrawing American support. So what are your opinions on America's role? I think that means, if I'm interpreting this correctly, maybe that means in the current conflict, in the current war, and then post as well. What do you see America's role being?
Let's see what happens.
I can answer the question myself on what I see, but
no, I think we need to see what happens in 2024. I also think that one thing needs to be understood: the United States is not giving Israel aid; they are selling Israel weapons. There's a difference. Let's just make sure
they're actually just subsidizing their industry. They're not even really selling weapons.
Well, yeah, well, that's how it's been for the last decade plus, in terms of the memorandum of understanding. But when it comes to what Biden has had to do because Congress can't agree on anything right now, it hasn't, in my understanding, has been to actually just sell Israel weapons because Israel stopped manufacturing a lot of the ammunition that it would need for a war like this because it wasn't expecting it. And so they need, replacements for it. And that's one thing, I think that at the end of the day, Israel has always said we need to be able to protect ourselves by ourselves. That doesn't mean that Israel wants to be alone in the world and to be, abandoned on the world stage and to have to go against everyone else. And I think that the partnership between Israel and the United States has been a major pillar. But let's not forget that partnership did not exist by any means for at least the first 20 years of Israel's existence. There was an arms embargo, the Harry Truman was told, and so was Eisenhower, that Israel's days were always going to be numbered, that they were going to eventually collapse. And so supporting them was a dangerous prospect because then you would be putting at risk losing the entirety of the Middle Eastern oil to the Soviets. So it is not something that Israelis should take for granted. I also think that the Israeli-United States relationship isn't what people think it is. Israel is not just the U.S.'s, bastard child that they just get all this charity from. Israel gives back to the United States at least as much as it gives. And that is a topic for a much longer conversation, but it is a fact. Israeli technology and intelligence has saved a lot of American lives, and that is just the way it is. And so what I'll say is I do think that it would be beneficial to Israel to continue to build up their own defense structure to be less reliant on the United States moving forward, even though I always think they will need to be reliant to a certain extent to ensure their qualitative military advantage. But it allows changes of administration, and you never know what the next generation is going to bring and who it's going to be, to exercise a certain amount of pressure that Israel may not be able to withstand. So I do think that that there's something to be said about, going into it with eyes open, being very appreciative of that relationship, but also being a little more realistic about it. I don't think people really understand how symbiotic that relationship is and how relatively new that relationship is. It really is only since 67 that Israel was seen as here to stay, and not just on borrowed time.
So I would say this question really feeds into kind of the false narrative that Israel is this very temporary colonialist outpost of the United States. I think as a Palestinian, I've been hearing that most of my life. And I think when you look at the facts on the ground, I think it's just completely false. I think the United States could pull all support from Israel and Israel would still be able to survive. And I think that one of the great delusions that feeds a lot of the Palestinian anti-Zionism is the idea that if the US pulls the plug on Israel, then what's going to happen is Biden going to call Netanyahu into the room and say, our attempt to colonize the Middle East has failed, Benjamin, please come home. It's completely delusional, right? So I think it's something that Palestinians need to look past. I think we have to understand that Zionism is here to stay, and we need to learn to live, as peaceful and respectful equals to the Israeli state. But from a Palestinian perspective, I would say it's incredibly important that Palestinians develop our own relationships with the United States, with Great Britain, with the EU. And I think it's incredibly important that Palestinians are, in terms of building a Palestinian future, have the support of the United States. So I would strongly encourage Palestinians to listen to the US, to stand alongside the US, to offer friendship to the US. I see the US, the UK, and the EU as future allies for the Palestinian state.
Can I ask you a quick question, John, if that's all right? It just popped into my head as you were talking, and now I don't want to lose it. Do you think there would be value from what you have seen and experienced, and otherwise the comments that you've seen from others, or the people that you've talked to who may be the more moderate voices, in looking into both Palestinian and Jewish history a little bit, to understand how much more the same we are than we are different, in terms of Palestinians are vast majority either the Jews' cousins or are our brothers and sisters who were forcibly converted to Islam and Arabized and became the Mustarabim, during conquests like the Al-Hakim Edict in the early 11th century and things like that. Is that something that you've seen any appetite for looking into and considering, and can it bring these people together as we're just one really big, extremely dysfunctional family, but families eventually make up? Is there anything to that?
I think it's essentially true that on a genetic level we're one big family, right? I mean, particularly with Israel. I mean, the entirety of humanity is one big family, but particularly Israelis and Palestinians, the Jewish people, and the Levantine Arabs are deeply interconnected. In terms of appetite that I see from other Palestinians, no, honestly, I don't see a lot of discussion about this. I think it's an extremely interesting topic, though. I think we have to be honest about who we are. I think as a Palestinian, my ancestors were probably Jewish people.
It's an incredible thing that you've just said there, though. Most Palestinians, whether it's true or not, would never admit that publicly, in my personal opinion, and just from the things that I've seen and understood. There are some Palestinian families that sort of know and understand that they have Jewish roots, but it's something that's not talked about. Certainly not publicly. It may have been talked about in the 19th century, but as soon as the Zionists started coming in, it became dangerous to associate with Jews. But I've seen.
I think it's still a bit dangerous, to be fair. But
oh no doubt,
absolutely.
But I mean, I remember seeing documentaries where Palestinians had their faces blurred and their voices changed, opening up little secret, openings in their walls, and inside they had a menorah and a Hebrew prayer book that was probably like as old as the Dead Sea Scrolls almost. I just that there was an understanding that they were originally Judeans or Jews, whatever you want to call them.
That's reality. I think
that doesn't mean all. I don't know the percentage.
I think the genetic results that we've seen show that there's an intense amount of connection between genetically between Levantine.
I'm going to be honest. You and I look like we could be related. I'm just going to say that.
Probably we could be.
Yeah, I can see a resemblance in your face for what it's worth. And maybe it's because I want to see it. I don't know. But I just wanted to throw that out there because I think it's something that's not talked about today. That had been talked about previously. There was some discussion about it with Ben Gurion and Moshe Dayan for a period of time. And then there was Tzvi Messinai's book, a little bit later talking about this connection. And I do, wonder if that could ultimately be part of the healing process, would be realizing that these people that you've been seeing as your enemies, they're either your cousins or your brothers.
It can't hurt.
Get it that way.
It can't hurt. That's what I would say. I'm not sure it's the solution the way that maybe Zvi Messinai thought it was, but it can't hurt.
The way I see it is that even without going into genetics, I mean, this is what you had with the Abraham Accords. Mm-hmm. The single word Abraham indicated a narrative transformation away from the dominant view in the Arab world of the Jews as white, European, settler, colonialist, crusaders, essentially synonyms for foreign, and therefore they need to be pushed out, into a single word, Abraham, that indicates an Arab and Muslim recognition of kinship, of connected history, of belonging, and thereby making the state of Israel, rather than a foreign implant, the continuation of the history of a people. In that sense, I think it's whatever way you construct it, it's clear that ultimately peace will depend on an Arab and Muslim and Palestinian narrative that views the Jews as belonging in this country, and that their self-determination emerges from a legitimate historical and cultural belonging, rather as some foreign implant, which therefore needs to be pushed out.
Well said. Thank you.
Very well said. And then, so one last question, and I like that a lot. Now let everyone go. What are some other voices in the discourse that you all would recommend outside of yourselves? Anyone come to mind? And honestly,
I've been recommending John to everyone.
I have too. I've been recommending all three of you a lot, actually. But if that's something you can think about too, and send over in a tweet or something, or a DM. Again, these are discussions I want to keep having. My mind keeps going back to your quote, Dr. Wilf, of publicly and often and loudly. It's so important. Everything you guys are doing is so important, and I love being a part of it. I'm very grateful to be a part of it. And you're always welcome back on my platform, whatever platform I can provide. So again, thank you, everybody. I'll give you your nights back, and I'll give you your days back. I hope it's all a good one. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.
And thank you, Troy, for hosting. And thank you, Dr. Wilf. And thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Take care, guys.
You too.